Mommy, there's something in my room.
In a small town in Horicon, Wisconsin, the Tallman family moved into what seemed like the perfect home. But soon they would uncover something terrifying, something they couldn't explain, and it all began with a bunk bed, and a shadow lingered just on the edge of sight.
It's in the house, Deb. It's in the house.
What started out as an ordinary life turned into a nightmare, a haunting so terrifying that it drove them from their home forever. Today we tell the story of the Tallman family and the evil encountered within their walls. In 1986, Alan and Debbie Tallman, along with their young children, moved into a brand new home on Larrabee Street. The town, mostly farmland, was just under 3,000 residents at the time. It was a very tight-knit community, quiet and slow-paced. The Tallmans secured the 3-bedroom house through a low-interest farmer's loan, making it the perfect spot for their ever-growing family.
Well, yeah, it was our dream house because, it was something that we figured we were going to be there for a long time, and it was a dream house.
Their children, whose names have been changed per the family's request from years ago, are going to be Seth, who will be 7, and Laura, who's 2. Each had their own room. Debbie is now pregnant with their 3rd child, a girl that we're going to call Jordan. And they were excited to settle into what they hoped would be their forever home. But just like many of the episodes that we cover here on Retraced Echoes, that will become a distant dream. Something more like a nightmare. Now, the neighborhood itself was recently built. 10 very modest homes on a plot of marshland that not long ago had been the hangout of local teens. Now, these fresh houses, they sat on a quiet dead-end street without sidewalks, with a railroad track that was cutting right through the backyards, and a gas station that was nearby that served as a gateway to the town. The Tallman family, they fit right in, eager to start their new peaceful life, working extremely hard and raising their children in what they hoped would be a safe and stable home. Owning this home to them was everything. It was their first home, and they dreamed of paying it off before they retired. Now, when purchasing the home, they learned that the previous owners had only been there for 18 months, but regardless, the house was in great condition and needed no major renovations. So Alan and Debbie, they put their personal touches with some fresh paint and some new decorations, making it feel like it was their own. Now, not long after moving in, the Tallmans stumbled upon a set of bunk beds for only $100 at a secondhand store. With another child on the way and only 3 bedrooms, they figured that it only made sense to make the purchase, planning for the girls to eventually share the same room. But for now, the bunk beds were stored away in the basement, waiting for the right time to be used. As the Tallman family settled into their new home, things started taking a very odd turn. See, at first it was very subtle, barely noticeable when you have the busyness of everyday life. But slowly, it became clear that something wasn't right. The entire family started to become ill, one by one. With Sarah and Laura, they were constantly missing school and making trips to the hospital. Now, before moving into the house, they had very rarely ever been sick. But now, illnesses was a constant in the home.
After we moved into the house, it seemed like our children were sick all the time. We had them into the doctor's office. Sometimes I would have all 3 of them in a week.
Debbie just brushed it off with what seemed like probably the most logical thing, that the kids were just adjusting to their new school. Maybe their immune systems, it was taking some time to adapt to the new environment. But then Laura, she seemed to be hit the hardest. In just a few short months, she contracted chickenpox, an ear infection, and several rounds of colds, one illness after another. Now, even Alan wasn't immune to the strange waves of sickness. He began suffering from intense back pain, so severe that he'd be bedridden on occasion. Debbie and Alan started to wonder if maybe there was something inside the house that was making them all sick. So they decided to bring in a building inspector to check for any kind of hazards, from asbestos to toxic gases to any other kind of harmful substances. However, the inspection turned up nothing The house was declared completely safe, everything was up to code, and no issues were found. But despite the clean bill of health, Alan couldn't shake a growing sense of unease, especially when the nighttime would come to visit. He would become uncomfortable, but he never knew why. He described feeling itchy and restless, as though something unseen was bothering him. His patience began to wear thin, and to Debbie's surprise, his behavior shifted dramatically. Alan, once a calm and loving father, began to lose his temper more frequently. And he even started drinking very heavily during the week, something he had never done before. Now, it wasn't long before Debbie started to wonder if maybe it was the house itself, or maybe something inside that was affecting Alan. And she wasn't the only one that felt like that. Friends and family would oftentimes visit the house, and they started to notice that there was an unsettling atmosphere. What was once a very lively house filled with guests started to decrease as people stopped wanting to spend any kind of time there. The Tallmans couldn't help but notice they were becoming more and more cut off from the outside world, as if the house itself was pushing everyone away. Now, what once was their dream home had now turned to a place filled with sickness, tension, and gloom. The excitement of moving in had long faded, replaced by despair that hung over the Tallman's house like a dark cloud. During the routine checkup on her pregnancy, Debbie received very unsettling news. You see, her placenta, it was in the wrong position. Her doctor very strongly advised that she take it easy and rest as much as possible, which meant that Debbie was confined to the house. Now, for the next couple of months, Debbie's mother stepped in to help, visiting nearly every day to cook, clean, and watch after the children. She wanted to make sure that Debbie could focus on staying healthy the remainder of her pregnancy. In time, Debbie gave birth to a healthy little baby girl. Shortly after, Debbie returned home with a newborn. Her mother pulled her to the side for a little heart-to-heart. Now that the pregnancy that was filled with complications was over, she finally felt like she could open up. For months, she had been holding back, but now it was clear. Debbie's mother could no longer stay in the house. She admitted almost apologetically that something about the place had been getting to her. It wasn't even rational, she said, but she felt completely uneasy, nauseated, and oftentimes suffocated, as if the house itself was pressing down on her. She loved the house as far as on the surface. It was beautiful. It was a spacious home, perfect for raising a family. But every time she left, she felt that overwhelming sense of relief, as if the weight had been lifted off of her shoulders. Now, Debbie's sister, she also felt very uncomfortable there. She was saying the same exact thing as their mother. She would mention the same oppressive feelings whenever she would be inside the home. Now, Debbie, she was overwhelmed just being a brand new mother again and trying to make sense of it all. So she would just shrug it off. With a newborn in the house, the thought of dealing with some of these claims were just too much. She told her mother and sister that if they felt uncomfortable, they could definitely leave. She would definitely understand. Now, time went by, and Alan and Debbie, they took a much-needed break. It seemed like forever that they'd been able to go out on their own, just the two of them. So they picked the date on the calendar, and they got a babysitter. They wanted to head out to a relaxing date night at one of their favorite local restaurants. This for them would make it to where they could get away from the stress and all the sickness that had been consuming their lives since they moved into the house. It felt like a breath of fresh air. They had such an absolutely amazing night. It'd be a night that they would remember forever. But for all the wrong reasons. They would pull back into the driveway, walk back into the house like two lovebirds. But as the door opened, the tension crept right back in. There, standing right in front of them, was the babysitter, visibly shaking, her breath coming in short gasps, an odd wide-eye expression on her face as she began to explain. See, it was she and Seth that had been sitting at the kitchen table enjoying a simple board game. Everything had been normal until they heard a soft tapping noise. At first, it just seemed innocent enough, but the noise grew louder, and then the soft tapping became a very persistent banging. Then the moment that left them both terrified, the chair at the far end of the table, it began to rock back and forth, slowly at first, then faster and faster and faster, his legs slamming against the floor. Then, to their horror, the chair lifted up into the air and slammed right back into the ground with a very heavy thud. Slid away from the table, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped, and the room fell silent. Now, both Seth and the babysitter were scared to death. It took a while for the babysitter to even calm down enough to think about putting Seth to bed. Now, after that, the house seemed to return back to its very eerie quiet. Now, when Alan and Debbie returned home and heard the babysitter talking about all this crazy stuff that was happening, they didn't quite believe her. It sounded too bizarre, too far-fetched. After thanking her, they paid the babysitter and they drove her home. Later, they would sit down with Seth and they would ask him what happened. To their surprise, he would tell them the same exact story that the babysitter had told. But still, Alan and Debbie, they couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe one of the two of them wanted to take their foot and just nudge the chair to try to scare the other person. And with all this going on with the game, it caused such a commotion that maybe they both made themselves hysterical. So they brushed it off, trying to push a strange event from their minds. Now, months would go by and nothing strange really happened around the house. If anything, it was like life was going back to normal for the Tallman family. But soon, little Jordan, she was going to be getting to the age to where she would need her own bed. Alan and Debbie realized this relatively quick. I mean, Jordan was almost to the point to where she was starting to outgrow her crib now. So they decided to move Seth into the small bedroom and then let Jordan and Laura share the much bigger bedroom. Now with that, Alan and Debbie figured it was finally time to bring those secondhand bunk beds from the basement up to the girls' room. So as they moved it in, they got Seth situated in his own room and even added an old clock radio to the nightstand. You see, Seth, whenever it was nighttime for him, it was easier for him to go to sleep if he had some type of white noise. They would usually set the sleep timer to turn off after it had been a little while. But on the very first night in his brand new room, something very odd happened. The radio began switching stations all on its own, jumping between channels and doing it at random. The next day, Seth would tell his mom about it, but Debbie didn't think much of it. She assumed it was probably some type of electrical glitch, so they would go and reset the radio, thinking that would probably fix whatever the problem was. But later that night, when everybody else had went to bed, Seth cried out into the darkness. Debbie would rush in to see what happened, what had went wrong, and this time, Seth said that he saw the actual dial on the radio start to turn on its own. I mean, the dial itself had physically turned as if an invisible hand was trying to adjust the station.
My son, he came running out in the living room, and he says, "But Mama and Dad," he says, "I seen it, the dial moved." He said the indicator went from one side to the radio to the other.
Now, Debbie, she tried to calm down her son, but she couldn't deny how scary it all sounded. Seth wasn't the type of kid that had trouble sleeping or making up stories. He'd always been truthful, and his sudden distress, it seemed genuine. Later, when Debbie and Alan would talk in private, even they tried to rationalize it. They thought that maybe Seth had been overwhelmed by all the changes, the move, his lingering illness, switching schools, and now being in a new bedroom. Let's be honest, for most young boys, that would be a lot to handle. Now, the outburst didn't stop. In fact, one night, Seth ran from his room screaming at the top of his lungs. He said he saw the suitcase that was underneath his bed slide across the room, and then it just sat there. And it very ominously slid itself slowly back underneath his bed. Now, for Alan and Debbie, they couldn't bring themselves to believe any of this. They just chalked it up to him struggling to adjust, but night after night after night, he would tell the same exact stories. The radio dial that would turn on its own, the suitcase that would slide across the floor. His parents got sick and tired of hearing it.
We kind of looked at each other and says, well, if you're going to have a fit with the radio and cause this kind of ruckus, we'll just take the radio out.
In a fit of frustration, they finally decided to remove anything that Seth claimed was causing the disturbances. They took away his clock radio and they moved the suitcase out of his room. But see, the strange occurrences, they didn't stop. In fact, they only got worse when they removed the radio and the suitcase. The unsettling activities began to spread throughout the house. Laura and Jordan, who had been sharing the larger bedroom, they started waking up in the middle of the night screaming and being terrified. They would complain about strange noises coming from inside the walls. You guessed it, tapping and scratching and strange sounds that seemed to shift from one spot to another. Now, Debbie, from time to time, she would hear Laura in the room talking to what seemed like herself. And when all of these events would occur, Debbie would go in and talk to the girls about what was going on. But Laura told her that she wasn't just sleep talking. She had been speaking to someone inside the room. She described the figure as a witch with glowing red eyes. She oftentimes hid behind the bedroom door. The thought was terrifying, but Debbie, she couldn't just believe the story that her daughter told her. She figured again it was probably just Laura's imagination running wild. Frustrated, Laura would crawl back underneath the covers, trying to just go back to sleep. But the conversations, they would start up again night after night, as though the mysterious figure was always lurking in the room. Now, before long, Debbie herself would start experiencing some very strange things around the house. She would hear the garage door open, knowing that Alan was at work and the children, they were at school. Obviously, in her mind, this had to be an intruder. So she would call her neighbor to come over and help her double check the garage. But when they looked, no one was there. Now, this would happen multiple times, and each time the garage door would open on its own. But yet, the garage was always empty. Now, on top of all of that, Debbie started to have more and more nightmares, and they increased in how horrific they became. I mean, this was far beyond the typical bad dream. Each night she would have these visions that were so violent and vivid that they felt almost real. And no matter what she did, the nightmares never stopped. It reached a point to where she would dread even going to bed because she knew what was waiting for her when she would go to sleep. The emotional toll, it pretty much had become unbearable at this point. Now, with all the things that was happening around the house, Alan seemed to be the only one that wasn't experiencing anything out of the ordinary. I mean, besides the back pain that he had earlier, but that was mostly gone. But he hadn't encountered the strange phenomena that was plaguing the rest of his family. He figured the back pain was probably just from moving, if anything, the furniture around. So to try to help out the rest of the family and to try to calm some things down, each night when it was time for the girls to go to bed, Alan would lie on the bedroom floor until they would fall asleep. And then after that, he would head to Seth's room. He was a little bit older, so he stayed up a little bit later. Now, Alan, he was at the point where he just wanted his family to stop worrying. He wanted them to live in this house and actually have a normal life. But as he spent more time in both of the bedrooms, he finally started to hear the noises that the kids had been speaking about. The popping and the knocking, the scratches on the walls. At first, he thought it had to be something mechanical, maybe the boiler that was in the basement, or perhaps the rattling pipes that was inside the walls. But when he went down to check everything out, everything seemed to be working right. The only other thing that he could think to do was to hire an exterminator, and this clearly has to be rodents inside the walls. That has to be the scratching and the popping and knocking noises that he now can also hear. But again, after the inspection, the exterminator, he found no signs of rodents anywhere in the house. At this point, Alan and Debbie, they had not even entertained the idea of something supernatural that was going on inside the house. They were both practical, grounded people, and it seemed almost absurd to consider anything beyond a rational explanation. So again, they just thought that it was bad luck or maybe some unknown issue with the house that they just had not quite figured out yet. Now, a little bit of time passed and Alan decided that it was time to throw some paint on the basement walls. I mean, with the family constantly growing and the upstairs space becoming more and more tight, they all thought that maybe they could transform the basement to a semi-living area. I mean, it wasn't a big house after all, and they need a little extra room, so Alan gathered all the supplies and he started painting the walls. One afternoon, as he was in the middle of painting, Debbie called him upstairs. He quickly set the wet paintbrush down in the tray, and then he went to go see what she needed. When he returned to the basement, something strange caught his attention.
My wife called me up for dinner, so I just laid the brush and I was going to return after I ate my lunch. And after dinner time was over, I went downstairs, down cellar, and brush was in the paint pail with the bristles sticking up right in the paint pail. I figured there was something strange why this happened, why the brush got into paint pail, but I wouldn't accept that my house was haunted.
Now, Alan would grab some towels and clean up the brush, heading over to the utility sink. But as he started to clean the brushes, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. It was large. It was like a shadow. But as he would look up, there was nothing there. He just shrugged it off. He convinced himself that it was a trick of light or maybe just his tired eyes. They were playing games on him. But still the sight of the shadow left him with a very unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. So he'd finished cleaning up and he headed back upstairs, and he decided not to mention anything to Debbie. It seemed like nothing that any one of them should dwell on. Now, a few weeks later, Alan returned to the basement to continue his work, and at first, it seemed like everything was normal. But one day, something truly bizarre happened. As he was heading down the stairs, a blast of cold air had hit him. The temperature in the basement had dropped. It was freezing, and Alan reached the bottom of the stairs and he immediately noticed there was a strong draft inside the basement, but where was it coming from? I mean, basements usually don't have that type of a draft, so he started scanning the room and his eyes landed on the very source of the cold air. One of the small slider windows that was way up high on the ceiling was taken out, but it wasn't broken. It was as if the window had been carefully lifted from the frame and placed on the floor. Alan just stood there. He just stared at the window, trying to understand how could it have possibly been removed. I mean, none of it made any kind of sense. There was no reason for the window to just fall out and be placed right on the floor and not be broken at all. A little bit more time went by, and Debbie's mother came to watch the kids for a while. As she would flicker through the stations on the TV, little Laura would come and she would sit beside her. As her grandmother flipped between the stations, Laura caught the glimpse of something scary on TV. It was a scene from a horror movie where there was a group of people that was gathered around a campfire, only for a creature with the head of a pig to run towards the fire, screaming wildly. For a moment, Laura developed a very deep fear of fire and of monsters that lurked in the dark. She began to claim that she had seen spots inside the house that was also catching on fire in her mind, fires that she believed was being set by a witch with glowing red eyes.
At one time, my daughter had talked about a witch behind her door, and the fire, a lot of it was fire, and we had never mentioned it to our son at all. And then I'd say probably about a month later, he had said, "Mom, I saw an old lady standing by my door." And he said that she glowed like fire. At this point, I began to think that our house was probably haunted.
Around Christmas of 1987, Seth started to have his own terrifying encounters. He also began talking about this old hag with red eyes that appeared to him in his bedroom at night. He described it as a dark cloud that would form in the corner of his room, and from that cloud, the figure of the old hag would emerge, glowing like a flame. She would approach him and threaten to burn their home down to the ground. Debbie, she was desperate to calm him down, and she tried to say that maybe this was just an angel. If anything, she was just grasping at straws. She was trying to calm him down, but Seth, he wasn't having it. He was adamant that a figure like that was no angel. See, angels aren't ugly, he told her. It was clear that things were spiraling out of control. One night, Debbie and Alan, they finally sat down in private to talk over all the things that was happening inside the house. I mean, they had been accepting strange things for far too long, but now the children, they were constantly living in fear. They were seeing figures inside their rooms, the sleepless nights they were wearing on all of them. I mean, Debbie was already struggling with her own nightmares and exhaustion. The kids were constantly waking up, terrified of this witch. It had all become too much. One day in frustration, Alan, he couldn't take it any longer. He stood up in the middle of the house and he shouted at whatever was haunting them. He would say, "Leave my family alone. If you want someone, come after me instead." His patience had ran out. Later that night, he finally admitted to Debbie that something strange had also happened to him too. While he was in the garage, he had felt an invisible force yank a book right out of his hand. It was the first time that he had spoke openly about any kind of terrifying experience. It was clear. Something supernatural was happening within the walls of this home. So they did what so many other families do in the podcast that I provide here at Retraced Echoes, called for help. They reached out to a local pastor, Reverend Wayne DeBratz, hoping that maybe he could provide answers that they so desperately needed.
I'd known them about a year and a half when they called me to come and visit with them about what was going on in the house. I believe that my initial analysis of the entity being in the spiritual realm, the occult realm, the demonic, if you will, was accurate, and I still believe it's accurate.
In the early hours of January 7th of 1988, that would be the next very weird occurrence that would happen to the family. In fact, it would happen to Alan. Alan would park his car and he would walk from the car to the front door. He just wanted to go inside and go to bed. He was tired. He would reach down to the doorknob, and as he would start to turn it, there'd be a gust of wind that would push against his back. But what made this wind different was that it had a howl.
It started out real soft and then it got real loud. It was a real strong howling of wind, but it was quiet outside. And a voice came out of the howling and it says, "Come here." I ran around the sides of the house looking to see if anybody was there, and I couldn't see nothing. So I went back to the house steps, and the vacuum of the wind started up again. It started out real soft and it got real loud. And the voice said, "Come here." And it just kept on saying, "Come here, come here." And I focused onto the garage door, and I seen a glow.
It was then that he noticed the flames. They were starting to rise, flickering as though the entire garage was about to burst into flames right there before his very eyes. Stunned, Alan stepped back, trying to process everything that had just happened.
And I run. I got scared and I ran. And I ran to the house and I opened the door and I set my lunch pail on the floor. I locked the door and I stood there for a brief couple of seconds. And I says, "Oh my God, my garage is on fire." And I ran back out on the porch, and I looked at the garage, and there was nothing. The garage was just as normal as when I came home from work. So I quick went back in the house, and I closed the door and deadbolted the door and locked the door.
But as he bent down to grab his lunchbox from the floor, something invisible grabbed it, and it threw it violently across the room. Panicking, Alan sprinted down the hallway towards the bedroom, barely able to catch his breath when he finally reached Debbie. Told her everything that he had just experienced that night. Neither of them slept. Now, the next day, Alan and Debbie decided not to tell the kids about any of the events that happened the night before. And why would they? They had so much stress and aggravation and so much anxiety with the house, and they were still experiencing their own things. They didn't want to put them any more on edge. Now, Debbie did notice a very alarming pattern. During the daytime, everything seemed to be fine. But at nighttime, that's when things truly escalated. Her thoughts was as long as the sun was shining, they was relatively safe, but once the night fell, everything escalated to a maximum level. Seth continued to see this glowing figure of the old hag in his bedroom, and some nights, Debbie would hear him quietly whimpering, pleading with the entity to just leave him alone. The house itself wasn't silent either. Doorknobs began to turn on their own, windows rattling ominously. Every night brought a new layer of terror. By January 8th, strange things weren't just confined to the nighttime's hours anymore, though. It was after school, one of Seth's friends, he came over to hang out with Seth. He would go into the kitchen to grab a snack, and he would see something very bizarre. The refrigerator would be at a 45-degree angle, door wide open. He would scream. Later, he would tell Alan that when he was looking outside into the garage, he would see like a glowing, emanating light. It didn't quite match that of a fire, but it was still unsettling nonetheless. Later on that night, much like Alan had done in the past, he would lay on the girls' floor as they would fall asleep. He was hoping, if anything, just him being there would bring him some type of comfort. That's when he heard it again, that same howling wind noise. See, that sound had been stuck with him ever since he heard it. He sat up. He was straining to listen, still hoping that maybe there would be some type of irrational explanation. Maybe he thought it was just the furnace that was kicking on, sending that, that gust of air that comes up from the vents. But then something way more disturbing began to happen. See, a fog started to form. And it started to form right there on the floor. Slowly creeping across the carpet, it thickened. It would raise up into the air, swirling, until it became the form of the same humanoid figure. Alan's heart was racing as he recognized the form. It was the same figure that he had seen before, his glowing green eyes and red pupils. He was looking straight at him. A low grumbling voice emerged from the figure, filling the room with a chilling declaration. "You're dead." And with a sudden blinking, flashing light, the figure vanished, leaving Alan alone in the silence. As Alan would tell Debbie, she in a complete panic woke up the children and told them they had to pack a suitcase. They were leaving right now. As they would back out of the driveway, Debbie would glance back at the garage. She thought she saw a flicker of a flame inside, but when she blinked, the fire was gone, as if it had never been there. The next day, the family would return to the house, this time with the pastor, good old Pastor Wayne. He blessed the house once again and offered a suggestion. If you're going to stay, you should maybe play some church music throughout the night. Desperate for any kind of sense of peace, the family agreed, and that evening, they followed their usual routine. But this time, they let the sound of church hymns fill the house as they fell asleep. That night was the most peaceful night that the family had. They was able to actually sleep in their home, just them, without the fear of anything. They finally felt like whatever this was, it was over. Maybe this is what they needed to do to take back their home. Now, the following day, Alan, he had to work late, so he'd call over to his nephew, Jonathan, to stay over at the house, if anything, just to keep an eye on things. And Jonathan was a skeptic. He thought the whole thing was kind of foolish, to be honest. He thought it was funny the kids was scared of whatever this is, and heck, his own aunt and uncle, they were scared of whatever this was. So as they would be there, Alan would call every single hour and just kind of check in with Jonathan. And every single time, Jonathan would reassure him, listen, everything is fine. For a moment in time, Alan truly believed that maybe this was all over. This was all behind them. It wasn't until the sunset that the nightmare began. Debbie would later describe that night as being one of the worst of her entire life. See, it all started about 8 p.m. She was getting her daughters ready for bed. Now, normally Alan would lay on the floor until the girls would fall asleep, but with the things that just happened the night before, Debbie couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she would ask Jonathan if maybe he would just sit there and just wait until they fall asleep. And Jonathan agreed. Again, he didn't believe in any of this. It was all foolish to begin with. Now, Debbie would turn her attention to some of the things that needed to be done around the house. She was trying to push that fear to the back of her mind. And it was going pretty well until she heard the scream of Jonathan coming from the girl's very room, screaming and begging and pleading for Debbie to come. But Debbie was hesitant. Before she headed to the room, she ran to the phone and frantically called the pastor. "It's still happening," she cried. But the call, it went unanswered. She could hear the children screaming from the bedroom, crying that they saw it, whatever it was. Frozen in fear, Debbie couldn't bring herself to even go into the room. Instead, she shouted for Jonathan to bring the kids out. Scrambling, she grabbed their coats and bundled everyone into the car. She slammed her foot on the gas and they went right down the driveway. As they sped down the street, Seth's voice, it came from the back seat. "Mom, it's still looking at us through the window." But Debbie did not dare look back. She just kept driving, too terrified to see what Seth had seen. Now, they drove straight to Alan's work, and Jonathan told him everything that happened. And much like what Alan had experienced the night before, with the smoky fog that formed across the ground and then this humanoid figure that came up from it, had the glowing green eyes with the red pupils. Later, they would return to the house, but only to observe from a very safe distance. Sitting in the car, they noticed something very strange. Despite Debbie having turned off most of the lights before they left, every light in the house was on, casting an eerie glow from every single window. That would be the very last time that the Tallman family would ever return to the house. Now, of course, word traveled quick. Again, this is a small town. The locals started running with these different narratives and these different stories. It all became the family that ran out in the middle of the night, that the big oogly booglies had scared them out of their own home. There was demons inside the house, and there was this witch, and the family was scared for their lives. And of course, the media caught wind of all of these different stories. And then there was reporters that was around town. They was trying to get the Tallmans in for an interview, but the Tallmans wanted no part of this. They tried to remain somewhat anonymous. With them refusing it, the rumor mills just went crazy. They went wild. Various news outlets published very sensationalized stories. Some claimed that there was blood that was running down the walls. Others reported that there was this snowplow that came to life and was trying to mow people over. There was even talk that the house was built on Native American burial ground, or that there was like a portal to hell that was on the property. Of course, none of this was true, just rumors fed by the lack of official information. Now, after everything happened, of course, there were skeptics. They came out of the woodwork. They dismissed the Tallmans as attention-seeking drunks that was trying to make money off the story, but the family's actions suggested otherwise. They refused all media attention, and trust me, they had plenty of media companies that was coming to them. In fact, Unsolved Mysteries was one of them. It was during that appearance they agreed to be on the show, but they had 3 conditions. The first one was that their face would not be shown, the children's names, they would never be revealed, And they did that for their children's protections, hence why I even changed it from the names that was given on Unsolved Mystery. And the third thing that they requested was that all reenactments, they would be performed by the actors. From everything that I see, the family refused money. Debbie was also offered to go on the Oprah Winfrey Show. She declined that also. The family was also offered a very large sum of money from an unnamed tabloid, but they also turned that down, explaining that they wanted to make zero profit off their children's suffering. Their commitment to privacy spoke volumes. They weren't seeking fame or fortune. Now, over time, a lot of people started to speculate that some of the strange occurrences may have been linked to the actual bunk beds that was inside the house. Maybe it wasn't the house at all. They thought maybe the bunk beds had become cursed, and that was what was making the house so haunted. Now, the Tallman's family had gained some attention when it was part of the Unsolved Mysteries Halloween episode that was on October 26th of 1988. It was filmed on location at the actual house. In the episode, it became an absolute fan favorite. But despite its fame, the segment, it was never in any of the streaming platforms that would come after that. And when people would ask why, Unsolved Mysteries would just say, due to legal reasons and a desire to respect those involved. To see that episode today, you have to track down the DVD, or you could probably snoop around the old YouTube machine and probably find an episode there. Now, the Tallman story, it's also been detailed in the book Something Evil on Larrabee Street in a Haunted Heritage by Michael Norman and Beth Scott. Now, interestingly enough, the authors, they don't believe that the bunk beds were the source of the paranormal energy. Instead, they speculate that the house might have been built on an ancient burial ground, though this theory, it remains unproven. On February 19th of 1988, it was about a month after the family moved out, there was news that the Tallman had destroyed and buried the bunk beds at an undisclosed location. For them, they was certain that the beds was the cause of all of this, and they wanted to rid themselves of whatever was going on. Also, in a final effort to rid themselves of any kind of trauma, they put the house up for sale. Even though for them that meant taking a financial hit, the Tallmans ultimately signed over the title, and they gave up all equity in the house, losing about $3,000 in the process. But for them, it was worth it just to escape. Now, eventually, a new family would move into the house, and by all accounts, they've experienced nothing unusual. This only fuels the debate. Was it the house or something that was brought in that caused the haunting? The beds were gone, and so too were all the disturbances. The Tallmans relocated at Beaver Dam, hoping for a fresh start. In a rare quote, Debbie told a local newspaper, "I think it's going to be a long time before things get back to normal. I still can't sleep at home at night and not be afraid of the dark." Fortunately, since leaving the house on Larrabee Street, the family, they have not experienced anything paranormal. And so, the haunting finally came to an end.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Retraced Echoes. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And while you're at it, leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to give this episode a thumbs up and share it with anyone who loves a good haunting tale. If you're listening on a platform other than YouTube, be sure to check out our YouTube channel for more content, including exclusive interviews and visuals that you won't find anywhere else. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, Deceptive Reality, where we dive into unsolved mysteries and the unexplained. This is a podcast that Bert co-hosts with his buddy Nick. Follow us on social media to stay updated on everything coming up. We appreciate your support and can't wait to share more chilling stories with you.
I want to thank you all for joining this podcast today. If you enjoyed it, much like what Sarah said, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Tell everyone about the podcast. Also, we got Halloween coming up. Please be sure to go to our website and Maybe tell us your story. Who knows? Maybe it could become an episode of Retraced Echoes. But until I see you on the next podcast, goodbye.
Bargain dreams where darkness lies. To their home the shadows crept. Tallman family, no one slept. Witches, whispers, fires glare. Cursed bunk beds in night air. Silent screams pierce the glass. Haunting visions come to pass. Nightmares born of twisting wire. Cannot flee, though try they shine. Sheets like chains around their souls. Pay the price for what was sold. Hollow cries of distant pain. Echoes trapped in endless rain. Witches' laughter mocks their dread. Eyes awake in fear ahead.